The courthouse was a grand building with high ceilings and walls that echoed the solemnity of justice. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with the low hum of whispers, the shuffle of paper, and the occasional clink of a gavel. Judge Samuel Thompson, a man in his mid-50s with neatly combed silver hair and a stern demeanor, sat at the bench, flipping through the case files in front of him. His reputation as a no-nonsense judge was well known, and he rarely hesitated to make swift decisions, especially when it came to minor infractions. Today, the case at hand was a simple one. Tamara Carter, a black woman in her mid-30s, had been accused of failing to meet a regulatory deadline for a local community benefits program. The charges seemed trivial: a missed filing deadline and incomplete paperwork. It was the sort of case Thompson sought every day, the kind of infraction that could easily be corrected with a fine and a quick resolution. Tamara stood in the defendant's box, calm and composed, her posture straight, her expression unwavering. She wore a simple professional suit, her dark hair pulled back neatly, and her eyes reflected a quiet strength that Thompson couldn't quite place. Despite the nature of the charges, there was something in her demeanor that made her seem more significant than just another case on his docket. But Thompson didn't have time to dwell on such thoughts. There were schedules to keep, and this case, like many others, was merely a formality. "Miss Carter," Judge Thompson began, his voice echoing in the room, "you are charged with failing to meet a regulatory deadline for the Community Benefits Program. Do you understand the charges against you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Tamara replied, her voice clear and steady. There was no defensiveness in her tone, no frustration, just an air of professionalism that caught the judge's attention. Thompson glanced at the case file once more before looking up. "It's clear that you missed the deadline. This is a minor infraction, but it is still a violation. A fine of $500 seems appropriate in this case. Do you have anything to add before I issue the judgment?" Tamara hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Your Honor, I understand the fine, but I respectfully ask that you consider the larger context. The program I manage." Thompson interrupted, his patience thinning. "This is not a discussion about the program. It's about you missing the deadline. You were given ample time to comply, and the regulations are clear." Tamara's gaze remained steady, but something shifted in her expression. She wasn't arguing. She was simply trying to explain the weight of what she was doing. But she knew better than to challenge a judge in his own courtroom. "I understand, Your Honor. I will pay the fine." The judge nodded curtly, satisfied that the case was nearly over. But just before he slammed the gavel, something unexpected happened. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Tamara's calm, unwavering stare locking with the judge's sharp, authoritative gaze. It was a fleeting moment, but one that lingered in the back of Thompson's mind as he moved to conclude the hearing. "Very well," Judge Thompson said, his voice regaining its customary authority. "The fine stands. Court is adjourned." As the room began to empty, Judge Thompson's mind wandered, his thoughts returning to Tamara. He had seen thousands of defendants, but there was something different about her. She wasn't like the others. And though the case seemed simple, her presence left him with an uneasy feeling, a feeling he couldn't quite place but knew would come back to him later. As Tamara left the courtroom, her demeanor unshaken, Judge Thompson watched her exit with a quiet curiosity. What was it about her that had caught his attention? What was she really working on? Tamara Carter's life was a far cry from the simplicity suggested by her courtroom appearance. On the surface, she was just another professional, an efficient, well-organized woman who ran a community benefits program in the city. But beneath the calm exterior lay a woman with a deep sense of purpose, driven by a mission that extended well beyond the regulations she had just been fined for. Tamara had grown up in a neighborhood where access to resources was scarce. She had seen firsthand how families struggled to navigate the complexities of federal assistance programs, how forms piled up, how people waited for weeks just to receive a small fraction of the help they needed. It was a system that was outdated, inefficient, and difficult to understand, often leaving the most vulnerable communities in limbo. Watching this system fail so many people, Tamara had made a commitment at an early age to change it. After earning her degrees in public policy and social work, Tamara had worked her way up in the world of public service, all the while keeping her focus on the one thing that mattered to her most: reforming the federal benefits system. Her work had started small, helping people fill out applications and navigate local programs, but her reputation for understanding the intricacies of the system quickly grew. Soon, she was tapped for a much larger role, leading a nationwide initiative to restructure the entire federal benefits framework. The project was massive, one of the most ambitious reforms in decades. It aimed to simplify the application process, streamline the distribution of benefits, and make it easier for people to access the support they needed without jumping through endless bureaucratic hoops. Tamara's vision was clear: make the system more equitable, transparent, and efficient, ensuring that those who needed help most weren't left waiting in the shadows. But with great ambition came enormous challenges. Her team faced resistance from all sides, from lawmakers who didn't want to change the status quo to lobbyists who had a vested interest in maintaining the current system. And then there were the internal obstacles: outdated technology, a lack of proper funding, and constant scrutiny from both the public and the media. Every day, Tamara was in the trenches, pushing forward despite the odds. She was a force, but one that often had to work quietly in the background, fighting battles that no one saw. What Judge Thompson didn't know, what no one knew, was that Tamara had been working on a proposal that could revolutionize how federal benefits were distributed. Her plan, which had been in the final stages of approval, sought to overhaul the very regulations that had led to her fine in the first place. The same regulations that seemed so trivial in the courtroom were part of a broken system that Tamara had spent years trying to fix. That afternoon, after the court session, Tamara returned to her office at a nonprofit dedicated to social justice. The building was modest, but it housed a team of passionate individuals committed to her vision. She walked into her office, a room cluttered with stacks of paperwork, meeting notes, and policy drafts. The work was relentless, but it was her calling. She didn't have time to dwell on what had happened in court. The case was over, and the fine would be paid. But the work she was doing for millions of people across the country could not be stopped by something as insignificant as a courtroom misstep. Her phone buzzed on the desk, a reminder of the next meeting. The meeting would be a turning point, she knew. There were key decisions to be made, and the pressure was mounting. But for now, Tamara Carter wasn't thinking about the judge or the fine. She was thinking about how to fix a broken system and help the people who relied on it. Unbeknownst to her, though, the man who had fined her in court was already beginning to connect the dots. After the case was closed, Judge Samuel Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that something about Tamara Carter had unsettled him. It wasn't just her composed manner in court or the quiet dignity she exuded. It was the way she seemed to carry an invisible weight, a sense of purpose that lingered in the room long after she left. The courtroom had been her arena for a brief moment, but her presence felt like an echo that stayed with him. Thompson, a man known for his punctuality and focus on efficiency, rarely spent his free time reflecting on the lives of the people who appeared before him. They were just cases to resolve, names on a list, with little impact on the bigger picture of his day-to-day duties. But something about Tamara's case, her calm acceptance of the fine, her refusal to argue, left him uneasy. It was as though she had been more than a mere defendant. She had been a symbol of something larger, something he wasn't quite able to define. As the days passed, the feeling continued to gnaw at him. His mind returned to the moment when their eyes had locked briefly across the courtroom, and he couldn't help but wonder about the woman who stood before him. Who was she really? What was it that she had been doing in that courtroom for a case so seemingly trivial? There had to be more to it than that. Judge Thompson, unable to silence his curiosity, began to dig deeper. He started with the local news, searching for any mention of Tamara Carter. To his surprise, he found an article about her work with the federal government, detailing her leadership role in an initiative aimed at restructuring the country's social welfare programs. He had assumed she was just another local professional, but in reality, she was at the forefront of one of the most ambitious social reforms in decades. The article painted a picture of a woman who was fiercely dedicated to her cause. She wasn't just managing a small community benefits program. She was driving a nationwide movement, one that sought to overhaul the very systems of aid that so many people depended on. Tamara's goal was nothing less than to simplify the application process, make benefits more accessible, and address the deep inequities that had plagued the system for years. It was a plan that could affect millions of lives, and it was getting closer to implementation. Thompson's intrigue deepened as he read on. The initiative had already been approved by several key stakeholders in Washington, and the team she was leading was making significant progress. However, the article also highlighted the many challenges she faced: political resistance, budgetary constraints, and a tangled web of outdated regulations. One of those regulations, Thompson noted, was the very one that had led to her fine in the courtroom. The realization hit him like a jolt. The regulation Tamara had violated was a part of the very system she was working to change. The fine he had imposed wasn't just a bureaucratic matter. It was part of the very machinery that had created the problem in the first place. He had unknowingly punished a woman who was actively trying to fix the system that had trapped her in the same outdated regulations. Thompson leaned back in his chair, a sinking feeling settling in his stomach. He had acted quickly and decisively in the courtroom, but now he felt a pang of regret. He had imposed a fine on someone who was attempting to break the cycle of inefficiency he himself had been complicit in. How could he have been so blind? How many other cases like this were there, where small regulations were being enforced without understanding their broader consequences? The more Thompson thought about it, the more he realized he had been part of the problem. He felt a growing sense of responsibility to understand Tamara's work better, to learn what she was doing, and to see if he could play a role in supporting her efforts. But how could he approach someone like her? A woman so clearly dedicated to her cause, a woman who had just been fined by him. Despite his doubts, one thing was clear: Tamara Carter was not just another case. She was a force of change, and he couldn't ignore the opportunity to learn more. He needed to meet her. He needed to understand her work, and perhaps make things right. Judge Samuel Thompson had never been one for public events or seminars. His work was the courtroom, his expertise rooted in the cold, hard facts of the law. But the growing sense of curiosity about Tamara Carter's work gnawed at him, and it was a quiet Sunday morning when he saw an advertisement for a seminar on social justice reform being hosted at a local conference center. One of the featured speakers was none other than Tamara herself. He hesitated. Attending this seminar would mean stepping outside of his usual routine, but something urged him forward. The more he thought about it, the more he felt this was a chance he couldn't pass up. This wasn't just about her case. This was about understanding the systemic issues she was trying to fix, and perhaps gaining insight into how the legal system he worked within could either support or hinder her efforts. The event was held in a large conference hall, buzzing with energy. There were activists, government workers, and social reformers in attendance, each eager to discuss ways to change the landscape of public assistance and welfare. Tamara was scheduled to give a keynote address on her work, and the room was already packed by the time the event began. Thompson walked in just as Tamara took the stage, standing confidently in front of the crowd. He hadn't expected her to have such a commanding presence. In the courtroom, she had been calm and professional, but on stage, she exuded passion and determination. She began by discussing the scale of the federal benefits system, its inefficiencies, and how decades of neglect had created a system that was both difficult to navigate and grossly inadequate for the people who needed it most. Millions of people in this country rely on benefits to survive. But what happens when the system that was supposed to help them becomes part of the problem? Tamara's voice was clear and steady, cutting through the room. We're facing a crisis, not because of the people who rely on benefits, but because of the system that fails them. Our job is not just to improve it, it's to completely reimagine it." Thompson listened, captivated. It wasn't just her words, it was her unwavering belief in the possibility of real change. She wasn't just addressing a room of social justice advocates. She was speaking as though the future of millions hung in the balance, as if this work was her life's purpose. Her speech outlined the ambitious reforms she had been pushing for: simplifying applications, eliminating redundant steps, ensuring that help reached people in urgent need without excessive paperwork or red tape. She spoke about breaking down the barriers that kept people from accessing the very resources they were entitled to. She wasn't just advocating for policy change. She was calling for a fundamental shift in how society viewed its most vulnerable members. It was then that Thompson's initial discomfort began to transform into something else, something deeper, more profound. He began to see how her work and the fine he had imposed were connected. The regulations that he had enforced in court were precisely the kind of outdated rules she was battling to change. The system he had been upholding without question had created the very obstacles she was working to dismantle. How many times had he imposed fines or judgments on cases like hers without considering the broader impact? How many times had he enforced rules that kept the disadvantaged in a cycle of bureaucracy and despair? Tamara's speech was powerful, but it was the cue and a session afterward that truly caught Thompson off guard. A woman in the audience asked, "How do you plan to fight the political resistance to these reforms? How do you convince lawmakers who benefit from the current system?" Tamara's response was both practical and impassioned. "We engage with them, educate them, and bring them into the conversation. We demonstrate that these reforms aren't just good for people in need. They're good for everyone. We need lawmakers to understand that a functioning, fair benefits system isn't a cost. It's an investment in the future." As Thompson watched her, it became clear to him that Tamara was more than just a reformer. She was a strategist, a visionary who understood the complexities of policy and the human toll of failing to address those complexities. He had come to the seminar out of curiosity, but now, as he listened to her speak, he realized that he had stumbled upon something far more important, an opportunity to help change the system he had long been a part of. For the first time, he wondered if he could be a part of this change, not just as a judge, but as an advocate for the kind of reform that Tamara was working tirelessly to bring about. Judge Thompson couldn't shake the impact of Tamara's speech. The clarity with which she outlined the flaws in the federal benefits system and her vision for a more just and efficient future had made him rethink everything he thought he knew about the law and the people it was meant to serve. He had come to the seminar expecting to gain some understanding of her work, but what he found was something far more profound, a call to action. Over the next few days, his thoughts remained consumed by what he had learned. Tamara wasn't just another social worker or policy advocate. She was a revolutionary, working tirelessly to overhaul an entire system. He had imposed a fine on her not because she was guilty of any malicious intent, but because the very regulations she was fighting to change had trapped her in a web of inefficiency. He hadn't realized it at the time, but his judgment had been a small piece of a much larger puzzle, and now, the weight of that realization was heavy on his conscience. As the week wore on, Thompson couldn't help but wonder how many others were in Tamara's position. How many people were trying to change a system that was holding them back with outdated rules and red tape? And what role did he, as a judge, play in maintaining that system? He knew that he had to act, but how could he fix the damage he had already done? How could he make things right with someone who was, in many ways, fighting the very battles he had spent his career overseeing? He decided that the only way forward was to speak directly with Tamara. He needed to understand her work better, to grasp the full scope of the challenges she was facing. But more than that, he needed to apologize. He couldn't ignore the fact that he had been part of the system that had placed her in a position where she had to fight not just for change, but for her own integrity. The following Friday afternoon, Thompson reached out to her office, requesting a private meeting. He didn't know if she would agree to meet with him. After all, they were on opposite sides of the courtroom, and he had just imposed a fine on her. But within hours, he received a response. Tamara was willing to meet. The message was brief, professional, and to the point. She agreed to a meeting at her office later that week. The day of the meeting, Thompson felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew this conversation could change everything. He arrived at the modest building where Tamara's nonprofit was located, a place that seemed a far cry from the polished corridors of the courthouse he was accustomed to. As he entered, he was greeted by a friendly receptionist who led him to a small conference room. Moments later, Tamara entered the room. She greeted him with a firm handshake and a polite smile, but there was an edge to her gaze, an awareness of the reason he was there. Thompson couldn't help but feel the weight of his past actions, but he was determined to make things right. "Thank you for meeting with me, Tamara," Thompson began, his voice steady but earnest. "I've been reflecting on our encounter in court, and I realize now that I misjudged the situation. I didn't understand the larger context of your work, or the challenges you were facing. I imposed that fine without knowing how deeply flawed the very regulations I was upholding are." Tamara studied him for a moment before speaking. "I appreciate your honesty, Judge Thompson. It's rare to see someone in your position admit when they've made a mistake." Thompson felt a knot in his stomach. "I want to understand more about what you're doing. I want to help. I know I'm just one person, but I can't ignore what I've learned. What you're trying to accomplish, it's important. And I've been part of the system that's been holding you back." Tamara's eyes softened. "It's not just about me, Judge. It's about everyone who is stuck in a system that doesn't work for them. And the only way we can change it is if people in your position, people who have power, understand what's at stake and lend their support." Thompson nodded, feeling a sense of resolve settle in his chest. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but it was clear to him now that he had a responsibility to do more than just preside over cases. He had a chance to be part of something bigger. And it all started with understanding, with breaking down the walls between the legal system and the people it was meant to serve. "You have my support," Thompson said quietly, but with a newfound conviction. "I don't know how or in what way, but I will help you." For the first time since meeting Tamara, he felt a surge of hope, a belief that, together, they could create real change. Judge Samuel Thompson's decision to reach out to Tamara Carter marked the beginning of a profound shift in both their professional lives. The meeting, though brief, had been the catalyst for something neither of them could have anticipated. In that small conference room, they found common ground, despite the vast differences in their positions. Tamara, whose life had been dedicated to social reform, and Thompson, a judge who had once unknowingly upheld the very systems she sought to dismantle, had begun a conversation that would bridge the gap between law and social justice. Over the following weeks, their meetings became more frequent. At first, they focused on Tamara's ongoing work with the Federal Benefits Reform Project. She explained the intricacies of her proposal, which aimed to cut through bureaucratic red tape and ensure that aid was distributed efficiently and equitably. They discussed the logistical challenges, the resistance from both political and private sectors, and the roadblocks in the law itself that made her mission so difficult. Thompson listened intently, absorbing the nuances of Tamara's vision. It was clear to him now that the issues she faced were not just about policy changes. They were about dismantling decades of entrenched systems that had left the most vulnerable populations in a constant state of flux. He began to see his role not just as an enforcer of law, but as someone who could influence the legal framework to support meaningful change. "Your approach is sound," Thompson said one afternoon as they reviewed a new draft of the reform proposal. "But the problem lies in how we make that vision a reality. The legal system isn't built for change of this magnitude." Tamara nodded, acknowledging the point. "That's exactly why we need people in positions like yours to understand the complexity of the issues. It's not just about making laws stricter or more lenient. It's about creating a legal structure that supports the people it's meant to help." As they dug deeper into the project, Thompson began to shift his perspective. He realized that many of the regulations he had enforced over the years, those that seemed innocuous or procedural, were, in fact, part of a much larger problem. They created barriers, often unintentionally, that kept people from accessing the help they needed. For the first time in his career, he began to question how many cases he had ruled on without truly understanding the long-term impact of his decisions. It wasn't just the regulations that needed reform, it was the way the system viewed its role in society. People weren't numbers or cases to be processed. They were individuals in need of real, sustainable solutions. The legal system, with all its rigid structures, often couldn't provide those solutions, but it could, with careful thought and reform, create the framework for change. In one of their meetings, Tamara shared her frustration with the lack of political will to push the reform forward. The politicians are too focused on maintaining the status quo. They don't see the harm in leaving things as they are. But every day that passes, more people fall through the cracks. Thompson knew that this was the heart of the issue. Policy reform alone couldn't create lasting change unless it was backed by a judicial system that was willing to embrace it. He thought about the cases he had presided over, cases where the law was a blunt instrument, unable to offer the nuanced understanding that real-world problems required. How many people have been penalized, dismissed, or ignored simply because they didn't fit into the narrow legal definitions that governed their lives? "I can't change the whole system overnight," Thompson said, his voice thoughtful. "But maybe we can start by making small, strategic changes from the inside. I can use my position to influence the conversation, make sure that judges understand the impact of these regulations, the human cost of them." Tamara smiled, a look of quiet satisfaction crossing her face. "That's exactly what we need. The more judges, lawmakers, and administrators we can get on board, the more momentum we'll build. If we work together, we can shift the narrative. We can get people to see that these regulations aren't just legal hurdles. They're the reason so many people are struggling." It wasn't long before their collaboration began to take shape. Thompson began to quietly speak to colleagues and friends in the legal field, sharing what he had learned and urging them to consider the long-term impact of the cases they presided over. He also started to reach out to local lawmakers, sharing his insights and emphasizing the importance of supporting Tamara's reform efforts. Slowly but surely, the seeds of change were being planted. As the weeks passed, the momentum around the reform project grew. Tamara and Thompson found themselves working not just as allies, but as partners in a shared mission. It was clear that, while the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, they were no longer facing it alone. Together, they had the potential to create a ripple effect that could change not just the way benefits were distributed, but the very way society viewed its most vulnerable citizens. Thompson had come to realize that justice wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about ensuring that the law served everyone, especially those who needed it most. As Judge Samuel Thompson and Tamara Carter continued to work together, their partnership began to gain attention. What had started as private meetings and small conversations soon grew into a larger effort to bring real change to the legal and social systems. They reached out to fellow judges, social workers, and advocacy groups, slowly building a coalition of like-minded individuals who understood the need for reform. But as with any major shift, the path was not without obstacles. The resistance started small. At first, it was just murmurs among some of Thompson's colleagues in the courthouse. Some judges were skeptical of his newfound interest in social justice reform. They dismissed the changes that Tamara and Thompson were advocating for as impractical, too idealistic. "The law is the law," one judge remarked during a routine meeting. "It doesn't need to be overhauled just because someone says it's broken." For a moment, Thompson doubted his own resolve. He had spent years in the courthouse, committed to the belief that the law was meant to be an impartial instrument of justice. But now, seeing how rigid and out of touch the system had become, he couldn't reconcile the truth of the issues Tamara had presented with the outdated mindset of some of his peers. But Tamara's unwavering determination helped him regain his focus. She reminded him that the legal system was never meant to be static. "The law is always evolving, Samuel," she had told him one afternoon, sitting across from him in the same conference room where they had first met. "The system was designed to adapt to society's needs. If it's not, then it's failing the people it was meant to protect." Despite the occasional doubts, they pressed on, continuing to meet and strategize, reaching out to others who might be open to change. But as their influence grew, so did the resistance from more entrenched forces. Some of the most powerful lobbyists and politicians who benefited from the current system began to take notice of Tamara's work. They weren't content to let her reform ideas grow without pushing back. The first major opposition came from a group of conservative lawmakers who saw Tamara's efforts as a direct threat to the existing structure of benefits programs. These lawmakers were staunch defenders of the status quo, arguing that the reforms would only complicate the system and lead to even more inefficiencies. They launched a series of press conferences, speaking out against the idea of wasting taxpayer dollars on an overhaul of the benefits system. The media picked up the story quickly. News outlets began questioning the wisdom of reforming such a large and complex system. Some accused Tamara of being naive, while others painted her as someone who was trying to push a liberal agenda at the expense of fiscal responsibility. For the first time, Tamara began to feel the weight of public scrutiny. The pressure was immense. In a particularly heated public exchange, one prominent senator criticized her publicly, calling her reforms a pipe dream and suggesting that the system was fine as it was. He implied that the real problem was not the bureaucracy, but the people who couldn't navigate it. "You can't fix people's bad decisions with government intervention," the senator declared during a televised debate. Tamara watched the interview with a sense of frustration, but she refused to back down. It wasn't just about proving a point. It was about ensuring that the system worked for everyone, not just for the few who had the resources or knowledge to navigate it. Her focus never wavered. She knew that the fight would get harder before it got easier, but she was committed to seeing it through. Thompson, too, felt the weight of the resistance. There were days when the criticism felt overwhelming, when it seemed like the very system they were trying to change was pushing back harder than ever. Yet, in his heart, he knew they were on the right side of history. His belief in the law had transformed from a rigid adherence to rules to a commitment to the idea that the law should serve people, not the other way around. In private conversations with Tamara, Thompson would sometimes express his doubts. "What if we can't win this fight? What if the system is just too broken to fix?" Tamara would always respond with quiet conviction. "Change never comes easily, but if we don't push for it, who will?" Her words stuck with him. And though the resistance was growing, Thompson knew one thing for certain: they couldn't afford to give up now. Their work had only just begun. The months that followed were filled with an unrelenting push for reform. Tamara and Judge Thompson worked tirelessly, navigating the minefields of political resistance, media criticism, and entrenched bureaucracy. Yet, despite the overwhelming challenges, they began to see signs of progress. Their efforts started to gain traction in ways they had never anticipated. In the courtroom, Thompson's approach to cases began to change. He wasn't just applying the law anymore. He was considering its broader implications. He became a voice for those who were often overlooked in the legal system: the struggling single parents, the elderly, the disabled, and the marginalized. His rulings were more compassionate, with an emphasis on fairness and understanding. In several cases, he ruled in favor of individuals who had been wronged by a system designed to entrap them, rather than help them. This shift in Thompson's approach caught the attention of his colleagues. Slowly, more judges began to question their own long-held beliefs about the law. Discussions in the courthouse started to revolve around the need for reform, and some judges expressed interest in attending meetings with Tamara to learn more about her work. The movement was small, but it was growing. Meanwhile, Tamara's advocacy was reaching new heights. She worked relentlessly to expand the coalition of supporters, using her growing influence to bring lawmakers, activists, and community leaders together. Her calls for a more inclusive, humane benefits system began to gain wider public support. Grassroots organizations rallied behind her, and the media, once critical, began to see her as a symbol of hope for those left behind by the system. But the turning point came when a major federal benefits bill, which had been stuck in committee for months, was suddenly put to a vote. The bill contained many of the reforms that Tamara had been fighting for: simplified applications, expedited approvals, and expanded access to assistance. It wasn't everything she had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. Tamara and Thompson watched from opposite sides of the political spectrum as the bill was debated in the halls of Congress. The debate was heated, with both sides voicing their concerns. But Tamara's testimony, backed by data and personal stories from those directly impacted by the system, was powerful. She spoke with passion and conviction, describing the human cost of inaction, of a system that failed to serve those in need. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the vote came. The bill passed. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a monumental step forward. For the first time in years, a federal benefits reform had been approved, with bipartisan support. It was a victory for Tamara, for Thompson, and for the millions of people who would now have a fairer, more accessible system to rely on. That night, as the news outlets broadcast the results, Tamara and Thompson sat together in her office, the weight of the moment settling in. It was a quiet celebration, just the two of them. No cameras, no media frenzy. They knew there was still much work to be done, that the fight for reform wasn't over. But for the first time, they allowed themselves to feel a sense of accomplishment. "I couldn't have done this without you, Samuel," Tamara said, her voice filled with gratitude. "Your support has meant everything. You believed in this vision when it seemed impossible." Thompson smiled, a rare look of satisfaction crossing his face. "I didn't just believe in the vision. I believed in the people we were fighting for." They sat in silence for a moment, knowing that they had made a difference that would ripple out, changing the lives of thousands of people. The legal system had not only seen reform, but it had seen empathy. And as much as they had faced resistance, they had pushed through it, driven by the knowledge that justice wasn't just about laws, it was about people. As they looked to the future, Tamara and Thompson knew they had opened a door to something larger than themselves. The work was far from finished, but their collaboration had proven that change was possible, even within a system that often seemed impenetrable. Together, they had shown that justice, in its truest form, could be both equitable and compassionate. And with that, they had created a new beginning for everyone who had ever been forgotten by the system.